Happy Mother's Day. It's an honor and a privilege to get to worship with you on Mother's Day, so welcome. I asked the guys this morning, or guys and gals, our little pre-service thing at 8:30, I was like, so is it Mother's Day if you're with child but don't have any children? Yeah, see, and one of the dudes, my friend Clint's like, oh yeah, that's the most important Mother's Day of them all. Like, there's some precedent. I think he might have missed that one, so happy Mother's Day, Deborah and Jadine and Jason. Anybody else pregnant? Chris, pregnant? No? Okay. Well, happy Mother's Day if you are. If you're guest with us, visiting here for Mother's Day, welcome. We're thrilled that you're here. We're a church. Obviously, that probably doesn't surprise you. And our bent is that Jesus is who he says that he is, and we try to create environments that make exploring that safe and relevant and provoking. And at the same time, we're constantly reminding ourselves that the sole purpose of the church isn't to gather, but to matter in the community which it sits, like to bring tangible benefit. And to that end, I have to say, way to go with regards to Friday. Some of you may not know, but you all worked diligently and hard on this thing called Hell and Elves for Trails on Friday, which is this idea that we had to raise money for trails in our community, because when we ask, like, what's something that our whole community would agree, like, that matters, it would be trails, and so we started this deal. So way to go. Many of you worked very, very hard. Some of you were there as early as 11 and left at 10:30, and those of you that served one shift and attended another, and those of you that invited friends, like, thank you, and good job. And that was a blast. One of the things that kind of makes me bummed is, because it's not about me, it's about us, but I'm the one that gets to hear the stories. So I thought I'd pass a few of those on. One was I was in a coffee shop on Wednesday, and my friend, who probably comes here a couple times a month, does some youth stuff at another church. His dad leads at another church, and so he's here off and on, loves this place, but for obvious reasons isn't here all the time. And I bumped him in the coffee shop, and I was kind of, by Wednesday I'm into that like insecure stage of like, what is a church doing hosting this? I'm kind of stuck in that mindset and the tension of it all, and so I was probably a little too candid as I was unpacking that with him, and he said, thank you. Like, thanks, because I get to bring my friend who doesn't connect with Jesus yet, and I get to bring him, and he's served well, and it's this great experience for him. And then, halfway through the night, I get to go like, dude, this is led by a church. And they go, what? Really? And in fact, at one point Friday, Brian from the Blackfoot and Max from Lewis and Clark have done a great job of helping us see that one of the real challenges we have if we want this thing to grow into the future and really make an impact on our community is to serve the statewide brewers really well. Because obviously there's lots of people that want to do fundraisers, and they all want to hand out, and they all want free beer, and so they've done a really good job of portraying, like, put a towel over your arm and serve your brewers, our language, because that's what's going to make or break this. And so we worked really hard on that end. And then at one point on Friday afternoon, I had a brewer come up to me and go, dude, best festival I've ever been to. I was like, what do you mean? And he just started citing free popcorn, and he started citing all these things that we would take for granted, all these kind of generous moves. We gave them a room and all these different things. So that was fun. Every brewer sought me out, without solicitation, to say, we'll be back. Like, if you'd have us back, we'd love to be back. And then my favorite memory, well, actually I got two more. One is a man who shall remain anonymous, a business leader in the community who's been real helpful in planning this thing. I'll just let his words speak for himself. He came up to me about 7:30, saddled up next to me, and he's like, hey, Adam, I haven't been a part of an organized religion for, he looked at his feet, 2 or 3 decades. I was like, yeah, me neither. He didn't get it. And then he said, but these Narrate people, they're awesome. They're awesome. So good job, you guys. And then my last story that hopefully edifies you, was with the mayor. And I can't quote him exactly because I'd get fired. But he came up to me, and he was citing a meeting that he was in that week where the city was talking about the stuff that you all have done with the pine beetles, and they'd actually said, like, we don't quite know where we'd be with the pine beetle issue were it not for Narrate, and was just complimenting us. And then he was referencing this Borden Helena project that we're working on that we'll talk about in the fall. And then he referenced Elves for Trails, of course. And then he said, so, like, what the hell kind of church is this? So awesome. And that's only like half of the phrase. I mean, there are all kinds of colorful language that preceded that. So I don't need to tell you that when community members are saying that type of stuff about God's church, then, that's 3 years of work well done, so way to go, good job. On that end, one of the things, I don't know if this is the case for you, but one of the things that emboldens my faith, that gives me more and more confidence in Jesus, and though it sounds kind of backwards, it makes me more and more proud to follow Jesus, because as a Christian, there's so many embarrassments that we deal with. One of the things that makes me most proud is when I encounter some well-documented research, some real insightful stuff that gathers just how pervasive of an effect Jesus' life had on culture. I mean, we all know, and most culture know, that Jesus had a lot to say to the soul, and he had a lot to say for life after death. What's often missed is just how influential his ethos, his teaching was with regards to everyday life in ways that you and I take for granted. And so, for me, I love it when I run into stuff where they just unpack, like, Jesus changed this about culture, and though we take it for granted and it's not a religious idea, this is because of him. Like this last fall, we did a series called Organic Kingdom Bringing, and you remember that we talked about hospitals. And that it wasn't that long ago when sick people who weren't wealthy and they didn't have family, particularly if they had some kind of disease that was easily contracted, they died alone. Because if you couldn't pay somebody, no one was going to take care of you. And it was Christ followers who saw that tendency in culture and went, wait a minute. Like, Jesus would call us to take care of people. And this isn't a matter of religion, this is a matter of history. Hospitals were born out of that observation and conviction. Likewise, with regards to places like the Red Cross, it wasn't that long ago that when a battle happened and the wounded were laying on the soil and bullets flying overhead or, clubs being thrown around, the wounded were just left there to die and rot. And it was Christ followers, particularly in Europe, who went, wait a minute. I think Jesus would call us to army crawl out there and at least help these people die with dignity. Orphanages would be another thing. That it wasn't that long ago, though it's unimaginable to us, that if a baby didn't have parents, they just kind of went to the street or were left to die. And though we can't imagine that, the orphanage is an institution, if you will, an idea, a concept, a cultural construct that was created by people who were reflecting on the gospel and went like, whoa, wait, time out. Jesus would call us to restore culture in ways more efficient than that, more effective, more holistic than that. And so this morning, it seems appropriate. I stumbled into, in the last couple of months, some remarkable research done mostly by a guy named, well, not mostly, all by a guy named John Ortberg, one of my favorite theologians and communicators. And this remarkable research where he just really asked the question, what impact has Jesus had on what it means to be a woman, particularly in the West? Particularly in places like North America and Europe. Like, what impact did his ethos have on the whole womanhood issue? And so this morning, what I want to do, I'm indebted to John Ortberg. By indebted, I mean steal. Like, I'm stealing from John Ortberg. In academic terms, plagiarism. But what I want to do is just explore that question. Like, what impact has Jesus had on what it means to be a woman? And let me also say this before we jump into it. If you're someone that struggles with Jesus' divinity, that's okay. I just invite you to table that this morning, or at least initially. Because irrespective of what you do with Jesus' divinity, though many of us would believe that he was both God and man, there's something that we have to deal with regards to his humanity. Because Jesus lived a very brief life. He was a man who lived a very brief life. In fact, many of you have probably lived longer than Jesus lived on the planet, which is remarkable in its own right when you consider his impact. So he was a man who lived a brief life in a very male-dominated, male-centric culture. And what I want to suggest to you this morning is that he did things and said things and interacted with women in such a way that it continues to ripple out into the 21st century. So let's just talk about the world that Jesus was born into. In the Greco-Roman world, in the Roman Empire, historians would say that for every 140 men, there were 100 women. Every 140 men, there were 100 women. Now, you don't have to be a statistician or a sociologist to go like, whoa, something's not right. And the question is, well, what went wrong? And for some of you, you're familiar, and for some of you, you might be shocked to hear what went wrong. What went wrong was, where did those other women go? Well, where they went was they had the unfortunate, it was unfortunate for them that they were born the wrong gender. Because in culture in this day, if a girl was born and she was undesired, she was just simply left aside to die. And we'll talk a little bit more about this. There's a letter that's been found written by a husband named Hilarion to his wife Alice. context here is they're apart. She's written him a letter and said, like, I miss you. They already have kids. And he's responding to her. And what I want you to watch is the contrast of the callousness and yet the tenderness of a marriage relationship. He says, I beg you, take care of our baby son. If you're delivered of a child before I come home, if it's a boy, keep it. If it's a girl, discard it. You've sent me word, don't forget me. How can I forget you? I beg you not to worry. Wild, isn't it? I mean, here you have like a very typical interaction about a husband and a wife who are missing each other, and then there's like, oh, and don't forget to take out the garbage, right? And in this culture, again, this isn't scandalous, this isn't hidden, there's nothing about the black market. Like, this was everyday life. If you had a daughter and you didn't want her, you might go to the, what is that place called? The transfer center, is that what we call it, where we take our garbage? And you might put your glass in this pile and your construction materials in this pile, and there would have literally been like, okay, and then here's where the babies that are unwanted pile is. Like, that's where they go. And it was called exposure. Technically, it's called infanticide. Normal. And in fact, the law of Romulus, a Roman law, said that males were obligated to raise every son born to them, but legally, they were only obligated to raise the first daughter. So you had to raise your first daughter, but you had to raise every son. In this ancient city of Delphi, they've unearthed this. It's a new archaeological site, and what they've discovered is that there were 600 families living in that city. 6 of them raised more than one daughter. Now the question becomes, and this isn't spirituality, this isn't Christianity, this isn't religion. Historically speaking, what changed? And an honest historian, even an atheist-minded historian, will have to tell you that what changed was there was this movement of people, and it started small, and they began to reflect on this words of this Rabbi Jesus, and they reflected on the way he treated women, and the way he treated children, and the way he treated people in general, and they came to the conclusion, whoa, wait a minute. We better raise all our daughters. And the result was that mindset, it won the day. To the point where you and I are shocked when we hear that it was ever any other way, but we got to be careful, because history would say, no, that wasn't the natural progression of culture, and we'll talk about places that demonstrate that to be the case towards the end. Maybe it was this man, Jesus. In fact, it had to be this man, Jesus, in my opinion. In the ancient city of Athens, women were, of course, denied an education, and more so, women were property. Legal property. A woman in Athens never ceased to be the property of a man. As a baby and a child and a young woman, she was the property of her father. At the onset of puberty, oftentimes before, she was married off to a husband, and at that point, the transfer of ownership went from the husband or the father to the husband. So much so that in this culture, in Athens, if a woman was raped or seduced by another man, if a married woman was raped or seduced by another man, the husband was legally obligated. He had no choice. He had to divorce her. And in fact, the penalties on the man who either raped or seduced this wife, they were more severe if seduction was the issue. And here's why. Because the thinking was that if he seduced her, then there was a level of trust. And if there's a level of trust, what's not to say that she couldn't have given him some of her husband's money or property or possessions? See, the laws about divorce in this culture, they were property laws. The restitution required to be paid by the offending party, it didn't go to the woman. It went to the husband or the father, whichever was in play. And in this culture, it was very clearly laid out, the culture that Jesus was born into, what the role of a woman was, and that role was to propagate the species, to have kids, and lots of kids. In Sparta, the much glorified city, a woman was given twice as much food post-birth to a son as she was post-birth to a daughter. And the only way a woman in Sparta could get her name on her tombstone was if she died while giving childbirth. This was the culture of Jesus. And it was this culture that he begins to provoke and speak to. And as Western Americans in an incredibly changed culture, we take for granted. And if we're not careful, what we miss are these very provocative things that Jesus said and did. Like in Luke chapter 11, There's this place where he's being Jesus and he's doing these remarkable things. And this woman shouts out, "Blessed is the mother who gave you birth and nursed you." And you would expect Jesus to go like, "Yay, Mom," right? Like, "Yeah, way to go, Mom," right? But what he says, and maybe you've read this before and you go like, "What is up with that? That's kind of grouchy." "Blessed rather are those who hear the word of God and obey it." Again, you're like, that's kind of a grouchy statement, Jesus. Like, she just complimented your mom and you went like, "No, blessed rather are those who obey God's word." Come on, you missed your chance. That was an open window to say some nice things. But the provoking thing that he was saying to their culture was, no, my mom's value is not based solely on her motherhood. In fact, her highest purpose is not motherhood. The highest purpose of people is not parenthood. What he's saying to the woman who doesn't have kids is, you're not incomplete without them. You still have an identity without him. What he's saying to the woman and the man who do have kids is, your identity is not based solely upon how they turn out and who they become. No, what's he saying? No, the highest calling of my mom, the highest calling of any woman, of any man, of any purpose, is the glorious adventure of knowing God's will and doing it. See, what he's saying is, no, this like having kids business is important. It's not at the top of the deal. It's knowing me, following me. In Luke chapter 10, Jesus finds himself in a house with some apparently close friends. Mary and Martha are these two sisters. And as he arrives at this house, Mary sits at his feet. Martha goes to cook meals and do the things that she was expected to do. And eventually Martha gets very upset and she says to Jesus, like, "Come on, call her out. This is ridiculous. Mary should be helping me." And Jesus responds, "Martha, Martha." Like, you're in trouble when like, "Martha, Martha." I mean, that sounds like trouble, right? You are worried and upset about many things, but few things are needed, or indeed only one. Mary has chosen what is better, and it will not be taken away from her. Now, oftentimes we treat this passage as a very convenient passage for solitude and the importance of not being too busy, and like I've done that, and you've probably done that, and maybe that teaching's in there. What historians are saying who understand the culture, though, are going like, no, it was much more provoking than that. Because the statement "sitting at Jesus' feet," that's a very technical phrase, used only one other time in the New Testament. It's used to refer to Paul sitting at the feet of Gamaliel in the book of Acts. It's a privilege reserved for men who are the students of a rabbi. And what Jesus is saying is Martha, you've done what culture expects of you. You've done what culture expects of a woman. Mary, she's done what culture expects of a man. And I'm with Mary on this one. See, there's this slotting that happens to women, and probably every woman in this room knows what it's like to be slotted, and every man probably knows what it's like to be on the giving end of that. Heard a story about a marriage seminar, and I don't know about you, but I know most men, so this is my bias, live with the assumption that if you go to a marriage seminar, the men are going to get beat up. Right? It's kind of what we expect. And that's what was going on at this particular juncture, and the teacher was kind of pushing the men, kind of going like, you need to know your wives, you need to take an interest in them, like you're always asking them to come take an interest in your hobbies, you need to take an interest in theirs, and kind of shaming them that they didn't really know their wives. And his point, a little dated I think, was like, men, you probably don't even know your wife's favorite flower. And then he got real challenged and he said, men, I want you to turn to your wife and I want you to tell her what her favorite flower, I want you to guess what her favorite flower is. And the man in the front row, he turned to his wife and he said, this is easy. Gold medal all-purpose, isn't it? It's pretty awesome, isn't it? Jesus was pushing. You know the longest conversation between Jesus and another person recorded in the Gospels is between Jesus and a woman? We find it in John chapter 4, a rather commonly talked about passage where Jesus is interacting with a Samaritan woman, and there's a couple strikes against him. One is she's a Samaritan, and two, she's a woman. And there's this conversation that ensues about water and about eternal life, and they're kind of missing each other. And eventually Jesus says to her, you were right when you say you have no husband. The fact is you have had 5 husbands, and the man that you now have is not your husband. What you've just said is quite true. And again, oftentimes we treat this text like Jesus is calling this woman out for some level of promiscuity, that this is about sexuality. Probably not the way it would have been understood in the original culture. We don't know how many of this woman's how many of her husbands died of the 5. What we do know is there's not a single there's not any record of a single marriage that ended in divorce, and that divorce was initiated by a woman. I just butchered that sentence. There's not a single record from this time, from this place, of a divorce that happened that was initiated by a woman. See, far from a conversation about sexuality, Jesus is looking at a woman who's been rejected and rejected and rejected and rejected, whose whole identity is pinned to men, and he's going, I know you, and I know your story. In fact, we also know that there was a law in place that allowed for men to take women who were of a lower class than them and to take that woman and make her a concubine. Those are for harvesting corn. Or a second wife. They could take these women of a lower class, they could bring them into their homes. So what we know is going on here, and we know that she was poor because she was fetching her own water. He seems to be looking at her and going like, you matter. And you're about more than who the man on your arm is. I heard a story about a CEO in Oregon. Pretty powerful, influential dude, and he was, him and his wife were driving in Oregon, and of course in Oregon you can't pump your own gas. Did you know that? It's like you get accosted quickly. And so they stopped at this gas station, and they already had a plan, like his wife would give the gas attendant her credit card, and he would run inside and hit the bathroom and get some beverages. And so as he came out of the bathroom and was standing at the till, he looked out, and his wife was talking to the gas station attendant. And he thought, oh, that's interesting. And then he paid and came outside, and by then everything was wrapped up, and she was sitting in the car. And as they were driving off, she said, you would never believe it. Like, I knew that guy. Really, he said. Yeah, she said, not only did I know him, I went to high school with that guy. Really? She said, actually, I dated him in high school. Huh, he said. Then there was this kind of prolonged awkwardness. Finally, the CEO was feeling a little smug, and he turned and he said to his wife, I bet I know what you're thinking. She said, what's that? He said, I bet you're thinking, sure glad I married you, not him, or I'd be married to a gas station attendant. She said, no, actually I was thinking, if I'd have married him, not you, he'd be a CEO and you'd be a gas station attendant. I'd say we could push the conversation a little further, though, like why can't she be the CEO, right? And see, here's where we get into these cultural realities, and we're forced to reckon with them. Like, was it the natural progression of culture? Or did this man, Jesus, change things in ways that we take for granted? Jesus established a community. We know this. We're a reflection of this. In Luke 8, the Gospels talk about this community. It says, after this, Jesus traveled from one town and village to another, proclaiming the good news of the kingdom of God. The 12 were with him, and also some women who had been cured of evil spirits and diseases. Mary, called Magdalene, from whom the 7 demons had come out. Johanna, the wife of Chuza, the manager of Herod's household. Susanna, and many others. These women were helping to support them out of their own means. Another passage that we would just read right by would have been very provocative in his day, because in this day, in this culture, women and men were not allowed to travel together, mostly because women weren't allowed to travel. In fact, in the plays of this day, in the theater, most of the roles of women were filled either by servants or prostitutes, or they were filled by men, and the reason was because respectable women, they didn't leave the house. And the more respectable you were, the less frequently you left your own house, literally. And Jesus says to a group of men and women, come on, let's go tell them about me. Let's go tell them about my plan of restoration. And come on, like together. There's this mutuality. Can you imagine the things that must have been said about this community behind their back? Can you imagine the speculation that they must have experienced? And then they're financially supported by women, and Jesus isn't threatened by it. He welcomes it. Who was this guy? He addressed sexuality. In Matthew 5, he says, you've heard that it is said, you shall not commit adultery, but I tell you that anyone who looks at a woman lustfully has already committed adultery with her in his heart. We know that what Jesus is saying there is, do not make women purely an object of sexual satisfaction. Do not objectify them. And of course, there was a double standard in this day. Caesar Augustus ruled that adultery is only a public offense for a woman, not for a man. There's a story in the Gospels where these guys bring to Jesus this woman, and they say she's been caught in the act of adultery, and they're ready to stone her. And we often read that, and we go like, the injustice, where's the dude? This culture wouldn't have said that, because they understood, like, the dude didn't do anything wrong by their own standards. When two people, that's only a female offense. In fact, Caesar Augustus ruled that a man was legally permitted to have sex and be sexually involved with any woman that wasn't married, even if he was. And there was nothing his wife could do about it. His slaves, his servants, they were sexually available to him legally. They had no grounds upon which to stop him. They had no grounds upon which to stop him from shopping them out to his friends. In fact, in this culture, the only way a man could commit adultery was by having sex with a married woman. Why? Because that married woman was another man's property. See, in our culture today, there's this general assumption that sex is reserved in marriage for two people in a covenant and who both agree. We call what doesn't happen that way rape. They had no category for that. It was assumed that all it took is one willing party, and so long as he's a man and she's not married, that's all that it takes. And you have to ask, like, wow, what happened? How about identity? Did you ever consider, I hadn't before I read and listened to this stuff, have you ever considered that as Jesus was being taken to the cross, all the dudes were running for their lives, and it was the women who followed him to the cross? Ever notice that post the resurrection, the most important day in human history, the witnesses in all four Gospels, the first witnesses were women, right? Would that have been the case if this were a God who somehow said women are less important? In fact, and you may know this, but in this culture, women had about as much credibility in court as a dog. Literally. They had their witness had no standing in court. For you to go to court and say, this happened, I saw it, and you were a woman, would be like a man going to court and saying, my dog saw it. Same parallel, same level of weight. In fact, one historian, immediately after the resurrection, it started getting discounted on this level. A guy named Celsus says, the resurrection rests on the tales of hysterical females. Josephus himself, a noteworthy Jewish historian, said, let not the testimony of women be admitted. You know, one of the things that I think can give us tremendous courage about, or tremendous confidence in the gospel accounts, that the resurrection happened, is that if you were going to make this stuff up, you'd have never picked women to be the witnesses, because it had no public credibility. And yet, what does Jesus say to the value of women, and what was he communicating to these women when he chose them, when God allowed them to be the first witnesses? Is it any wonder then that in the early church, women were by far the majority of Christ followers? Because they'd never been treated like this. They'd never been talked to like this. And yet, to be sure, we've not caught up with Jesus yet, have we? The world is far from having caught up with the ethic and the ethos of Jesus. Well, one man writing in the New York Times, Nicholas Kristof, says this: due to the preference for boys, 100 million people in China, India, and other countries who should be alive today are missing. 100 million people missing on the sole basis that they're the wrong gender. In India today, there are 40 million fewer women than there are men. 40 million fewer women than men. I didn't know this until I was doing this research, but an ultrasound in India is against the law. It's part of the way the government is trying to curb this infanticide thing. Is they've had to make it illegal to get an ultrasound. The result being, of course, there's 20,000 black market, so to speak, ultrasound clinics in India. The binding of women's feet in China, death by death by the funeral pyre of widows in India, the horrible things that happen to women's sexual parts in Africa, polygamy, the denial of education. All these things, I think, at the very least, cause us to go, whoa, what? Is this a picture of what the world would look like were it not for the influence of this man, Jesus? I mean, was it really the natural progression of culture? And if so, how do you explain that a large part of culture who's, to some degree, untouched by the gospel to the degree that the West has been, how do you explain the disparity of realities? And yet, we got to be careful because we've not arrived yet either, have we? They say in America that for every one boy that has an eating disorder, there's 10 girls, and that today the average onset of an eating disorder is 8 years old. Girls who identify themselves and their value via a mirror. We haven't caught up yet either. One gal, Dorothy Sayers, who is a woman that is much celebrated. She went to Oxford early on. She's a provoking thinker and Christ follower. She says this, and she's explaining in a book actually why she chose to follow Jesus. She says this: perhaps it's no wonder that women were first at the cradle and last at the cross. They'd never known a man like this man. There never has been such a man. A prophet and a teacher who never nagged at them, never flattered or coaxed or patronized, who never made arch jokes about them, who never treated them either as the women, God help us, or the ladies, God bless them, who rebuked without demeaning, who praised without condensation, who took their questions and arguments seriously, who never mapped out their sphere for them, never urged them to be feminine or jeered at them for being female, who had no axe to grind, who had no uneasy male dignity to defend. Perhaps it is no wonder women were first at the cradle and last at the cross. They had never known a man like this man. There never has been such another. Now, where does this land? I had my plans, and you can kind of predict them along the lines of men seeing women like Jesus and women claiming their identity in Christ. It took a completely different direction for me, and you can do what you want. But here's where it lands for me, and I hope for you. Like worship. That we don't follow an arbitrary God who walked around and taught these esoteric ideas that really had no relevance on the planet on which we walk. That we follow a Jesus whose imprint is undeniable upon the culture. Who, yes, had much to say about life and much to say about death and much to say about where we go after death, but had even more to say about a God who was calling us to put our hands in the soil and make things right. To me, though it sounds a little backwards, it makes me proud of Jesus. Proud to know that we follow a Messiah who wasn't okay with culture, who wasn't okay saying, oh, it's all going to hell in a handbasket anyway, who wasn't okay with any of that, who came and changed things. A man who only lived 33 years on the planet, and yet some 2,000 years later, we raise our daughters because of him. It sounds a little backwards to say, like, Jesus, I'm proud of you right now, but I think the word for that is worship. Let me pray, and we'll give you a chance to do a little bit more of that through music. God, it does feel a little backwards to say we're proud of you. And we don't mean it in a condescending or demeaning way. But God, in a world where it's usually the worst of us that are pointed out, the worst of the Christians that make the news, it's so edifying and so refreshing to just be confronted with the fact that you are a God who changed culture. That while we've not caught up with you and we have our own embarrassments on this issue, that God, you were above culture. That you gave dignity to all people long before that was the consensus. Jesus, thanks that you invite us to impact culture, to not just relegate ourselves to the margins in our office, and to not go to the center with picket signs and blowhorns, but with a towel over our arm. God, that you would help us see people the way you see them, life the way you see it, even though it's easier to talk about than it is to do. We love you.